Hey everybody, welcome to session 9 of The Joy of Coding. Um, I am taking some family time. I'm taking some time off work this week, but I'm still here for class, and so that I'm clearly not in the classroom. Some mosquitoes are coming out, so we'll see how long this lasts. Um, but this is an exciting week. So sorry, just on that, both tonight and on Wednesday, I won't be in the classroom, so you don't need to be in the classroom either. If you do show up to the classroom, you'll be watching on Zoom like everybody else. Um, and actually, this fits in well because really what we're doing this week is talking about Project 4, which is our REST API project. This is a big departure from the first three projects, and I know that you guys are still in the middle of Project 2, but I want to make sure that we break ground on Project 4 now, so we can make sure that that the project works in everybody's environments. And so that you can really start to understand how the client server project is really pretty fundamentally different from the first three. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to break ground on it. We create a new Maven project for this because it's very different. It's got a web server component or a web application component to it. And so then we'll dive into all of that tonight. We'll see how to build it, how to run it, how to debug it, and then also learn about all the pieces parts. And then on Wednesday, what we'll do is we'll take the out of the box application, which is a simple dictionary application, and refactor it into something that begins to look more like your airline project. This is another example of refactoring. We'll get to see some of those tools in IntelliJ that we learned about last week. And then we'll also we'll show you the path. You'll see then how to start morphing, the again that dictionary application um, into your airline application. Before I dive into that, I wanted to open up the floor for anything that people would like to contribute. If there's anything on your mind, anything that you're wondering about, anything you'd like me to know, now that we are in the second half of the course. Give folks another moment to post if there's anything they want to post. If you have nothing, then please just respond in Zoom so I know that I can move on. Thanks, Jasmine. Sid, thanks. Thanks, Deboye. Okay. Excellent. Okay, then. Good way to thanks, Trevor. A good way to get started then. So let's dive into it. Got some exciting stuff tonight. So Project 4. So uh in the first three projects, we wrote command line tools for our airline. And it has several pieces of functionality, right? Project 1 was all about writing the fundamental classes. Project 2, you added a text file to persist the contents of an airline outside of the program in which it was created. And then in Project 3, you made it more usable by adding a pretty printing service and so that a human can read information about the airline. That's all really great stuff. And in Project 4, though, we add a whole new dimension to it. And what we do is we take the airline application and we split it up into a client server application with a REST API in the middle that they use to communicate. You'll be reusing a good amount of your code from the first three projects, certainly all your base domain classes like your airline and your flight. And as a matter of fact, you'll use your text dumper, text parser, and pretty printer as part of it too. And the client application is a command line program, so you'll be doing command line parsing in this too. So the goals of this project is to learn about web applications in Java, and I do hope that you took the time to watch the foundations of the web screencasts. I'll be talking about a lot of things that are discussed in there, like servlets and web containers, Jetty, all that kind of good stuff. Um, and so you'll get experience there. And then also work with a distributed application. I don't know if you've had an opportunity to write programs in which, a computer talks to another computer. If you've worked with a publicly available REST API, or maybe taken a networking class where you have two programs talking to each other, it's like a whole different dimension of building software, of running it. And there are some important um, techniques that I hope you're able to explore as part of this. Oh, good. Thanks, Yasmin, on the background. So you did some sockets in CS333. Yeah, this is similar. Instead of just writing bytes over a socket, you're really talking HTTP. And I go into gory detail about all of that in the lecture, but we'll be seeing some parts of it tonight. So I think the next thing I just want to dive into is the code. And so then before we talk really about yeah, before we talk about the behavior of the program, I do want to get the project started. So because this project is so different, because it's more than just a command line, it's got a command line, but it's also got the web server. We start with a new Maven project because what Maven will do is set up all the stuff for the web application. And there is a create REST project script that must be run on the CS department machines that will get us started with that. So I'm going to, let's see here, I'm going to log into the CS department machines as myself. And I'm going to go to my checkout of the repository. So the summer, oops, Joy of Coding, summer 2026. So this is not the cause repository that like we worked in like when we were doing the pairing and stuff. This is the repository that like you have that has your airline has like I created the student in there, so look at the koan, so it's that repository. And so it has a create REST project script. So I'm going to run that. And this creates a new project, right? Same thing we did when we created the koans or when we created the project one for airline. And what this does is it adds makes a modification to add a new submodule of the top level POM called airline dash web. And so this is the web application for the airline project. So I'm going to add both of those to Git. I'm going to commit them here on the PSU machine. And then I'm going to say commit, oops, added airline REST project. And I'm going to push that up to GitHub. Oh, come on. Let's try this again. There we go. Oh, it looks like I've got some stuff to pull in. Oh, okay. So I'm doing all of that. I'm going to do the thing that makes it so I only need to type my password once, because clearly I am not very good at it right now. Nope. There we go. So git pull, because I guess I have some changes that need to be merged in. Great. And now I'm going to push up. Okay, awesome. So now I'm going to exit out of this shell and I'm going to go back on my local machine. And now I'm going to pull again, and we should see all that stuff in airline web. Yep, there it all is. Okay, so then I've got a directory called airline web now. So I'm going to go in there. I'm just going to look what's here. It's really not all that much. There's a top level pom.xml. There's a Maven wrapper script, and then there's the source. So just like you did in your first three projects, you can use the same Maven commands that you're used to, like Maven clean verify, and this will run the entire airline web project. Now, the airline web project is different. It has a lot more stuff. Wow, that's really fast now on this new machine. Yeah. But it has the same Maven phases, right? So there is source code and it gets built and there are unit tests and they are run and there is an artifact that is created. Actually, there's two artifacts. There's a jar file that runs the command line program, and there's also something called a WAR file, a web archive, web application archive, that has your web application in it. This is all part of the same code base, but there are multiple artifacts that are created. And then, just like in your project one, two, and three, there are integration tests. But here, the integration tests are a lot more interesting because the integration tests in your REST API project will I think of them as true integration tests in that they start a new web application and then they will run tests against that web application, calling the actual REST URLs. And so then this gives you, well, a real test of your web application. And all of that was run just now. And we'll walk through what all of this means, for the rest of during our time together tonight. So yeah, I just wanted to pause. Is anybody playing along at home? If so, is there anything that you encountered that is surprising, something that didn't work or didn't go the way that you expected, with working with this project? And it's perfectly okay if you're just watching. The stuff goes by kind of fast. Okay. So good. Thanks for the feedback, guys. Appreciate that. Here's what's interesting about this project. I'm going to run some Java programs now, but I need two shells to do it because I have, um, oops, so I wanted to run Control Plus, because I've got, well, really two programs that run at the same time. So I'm going to go over to this directory, both in the same directory, but I'm going to be running different commands. Oops. So over here on the right, I'm going to be running the web application container. It's not, I wouldn't refer to it exactly as a web server. It's not like it serves up web content, but it's not like Apache HTTP D or anything like that. It's a simple Java web container. And so as you saw in the lecture, a Java web container is a Java program that hosts responds to HTTP requests. Is really that's all it is. And we'll talk about what the servlet is and how all that works here in a couple of minutes. But I wanted to show you how it works to just give you a feel of what it is that we're working with. The way you run, and the name of the web container is something called Jetty. It's an open source project, been around for a long time, that provides a lightweight web application container for Java programs. It has great integration with Maven. So when I run Maven W Jetty run, which is the run goal of the Jetty plugin, when I run it from the airline web directory, what that does is that runs the web application, and it starts it on port 8080. Um, and so it's running on the loopback address, the local host, on port 8080. So now it's just sitting there, just waiting for someone to talk to it. So I'm one way to talk to it. Actually, one way to talk to it is through the web browser. Maybe we should do that. Let's open up here. We'll do HTTPS. Sorry, just do regular HTTP. We're not using certificates here. And we'll just say localhost 8080. So I don't know if you've ever seen this particular syntax for URLs, but with URLs, here again, going to gory detail in the lecture, there is a host name for the resource, and you can also specify a port. And so by default, it would be port 80 for HTTP or port 443 for HTTPS protocol. Because we're not running on the default port, we need to specify it here as localhost 8080. And so when I do that, it actually returns a 404, meaning that it doesn't know how to respond to that particular request. But it does tell me that there are other places that it can respond to, such as /airline. And this is our application. This is the code. This is our code that's running here in this web container. So I'm going to click on that. And now I get this boilerplate HTML page. This actually comes from the project. And in a minute, I'll show you, where this HTML form is. But this is an HTML form that allows you to interact with the REST API. Um, Now, out of the box, what the code gives you is a simple dictionary application where you can define words and definitions. This is just again very simple to get you started, just getting used to having a client server program. I'll be working with that tonight, and then on Wednesday we will refactor this code to make it more like the actual airline. And so there are a number of things you can do with this application. Again, all of these HTML forms we'll just call the various REST APIs. So for instance, you can list all of the word definition pairs in the dictionary. And right now, well, there's zero of them. So you're not seeing anything there. But notice that the URL changed because what we did is we fetched that URL. We did an HTTP GET request for that URL and it returns nothing. We can also list the definition of a word, but there's no word yet. Actually, maybe we can do that. We can say, the word tree. What is a tree? And actually, it gets a 404 because no dictionary entry has been created for the tree yet. Okay. Finally, we can create a new word definition pair, which is much more interesting. Oh, it has the prompt from last time. So doe, a deer, female deer. I guess we'll probably make it a little wider. I can click submit, and it said, great, you defined doe as a deer, a female deer. Now, when I go back to this form again and I look up the all of the word definition pairs, it prints this out. It says doe colon a deer, a female deer. And then I can add another one, ray, drop of golden sun. And now I can see, okay, I've got all of them. And I can look at the definition of the word ray, and it says a drop of golden sun. So what I've done with this HTML form is interact with the HTTP methods that form the REST API. And I'll go back and we'll see those in a moment. As you notice, they're called like airline and flights. We'll see in the assignment what all of that means. But out of the box is what you get. So the REST API can be interacted with through this HTML form. And there's also a command line application that uses Java code to make the same HTTP request to invoke the same REST API. So here, it's a command line program, so we use java-jar, and there is an airline client jar. This is a command line program. It's much more simple than yours. It just takes four arguments: the host, the port, an optional word, and optional definition. So if we just say the host here is localhost and the port is 8080, if we just provide that, it it basically makes the same request as clicking on the list all word pairs definition. Sorry, list all word definition pairs. So it prints out everything in the dictionary. Similarly, if I just give it one argument, that will be the name of a word to look up, like ray. Again, if we try to look up the word tree, it throws this 404 exception, and we'll see later how all of that works in the code. And then finally, if we want to define a new one, me, a name I call myself. And if we then go and look at all of the words, we'll see that now me, a name I call myself is in the dictionary. And if we go and look at all the words over here, we see the same thing. Well, what I want to demonstrate to you is that both this HTML page and the Java command line client are invoking the same HTTP methods, not methods, invoking the same HTTP requests from the same server. And actually, you might have noticed that as I was performing operations over here on the left, there were things that were logged over here on the right. So, for instance, when I go and I, get a list of all of the dictionary entries, it prints get all dictionary entries. This is because we're performing HTTP get of all of all the dictionary entries. Notice there's three of them here. If I then go and get them all again, a fourth one was logged. So you're working with a distributed program. You've got you've got a client. Actually, you've got a server over here on the right. You've got a command line client here, and then you've got a second client in this index.html page. And so I'm going to put a picture up on the screen of here's how this looks, and we'll talk about the pieces parts. But over here on the right is that Jetty web container, which is again over here in the right-hand terminal that I ran with, if I go all the way up to the top here, I ran this with, oh goodness, so much output. I ran it with almost there, almost there, almost there. Oops. Well, I ran it with Maven Jetty Run. Jeez. Yep, it's still looking. Still looking. Wow. Oh, that was clean verify. So that was something else. Sorry, never mind. This is the architecture. So over here on the right, we have our Jetty running, and I'll talk about what's inside of there. But that's basically your web application. And then you've got oh, this should be Project 4. I apologize. I didn't update that. I'll get to that. Project 4 uses it has this command line is this command line that ultimately ends up invoking the same URLs as the web page well as the index.html. So that was a very brief introduction. I want to pause here though for anything else you'd like to discuss in terms of in terms of what you've seen here with the web application over here on the right and then various clients working with it. Is this similar to the work that you did with sockets in CS333 in terms of working with having two programs communicate with each other? Or does it seem completely different? Or was CS333 so long ago, you're just like, I don't know, a little bit more advanced? Yep, doesn't surprise me. Yeah, probably the data that's sent back and forth is a little richer in this project. And we'll see how all that works here shortly. Okay. Good deal. Okay. Okay, now this is how now that we've seen how this program operates on the outside, right? You've got the server over here on the right. You've got we've got the command line. We've got the clients, either on the left or in the web browser. Let's just take a look at the architecture to understand what's going on here. So let's just focus on the web container. The web container has several pieces to it. There's the container itself, and this is the thing that listens on port 8080 on localhost for requests to be made to it. You're live on my class. My neighbor just walked by. Um, and so it's sitting there listening for some client to connect, and that client really can be anything that speaks HTTP. So it could be a Java program, it could be a web browser, it could be a shell script, it could be a tool like curl. That then makes a connection to the server over the network, and then speaks HTTP to it, right? And so, as we covered in the lecture, HTTP is really just like it's a protocol. It's a language, like a communication language, that serves up content of various types. And here, what you're serving up is, well, it's just plain text. As you'll see, is actually the format of the text dumper for your airline, but we'll probably talk more about that on Wednesday. So the web container is on the outside, and inside that web container is this web application, the .war file for airline. And the WAR file has several things, but most importantly, it's got something called the servlet. So the servlet API is a standard API for Java web applications. And basically what the interface that it defines, the programming interface that it defines is here's how I respond to an HTTP request. So it has methods like do get and do post that you can override to then respond to get and post requests, HTTP get and HTTP post requests. And one of the jobs of the web container is to route the request to its servlet. So when a request comes in saying, hey, I want to do an HTTP get of /airline/flights question mark airline equals air Dave, what Jetty does is it parses the URL that's requested, or the resource that's requested, and it says, "Oh, airline." That means it goes to the airline web application, and web application can have multiple servlets in it. Ours only has one, and it's called flights. And so it says great slash flights, then goes to the airline servlet. Maybe we should call it the flight servlet, but I think you all understand. And so that's ultimately how it gets to the code. Now, that's the server side, and we'll be diving into the code here in just a moment. Actually, we'll be using a debugger to, walk through the code so we can see what happens. But I did want to talk a little bit about what happens on the client side. Well, the web client here, and by the way, something I want to make super clear here at the beginning, this index.html, this simple HTML with these simple HTML forms, this is used for only demonstration purposes. I'm going to use this here tonight because I would hope that a web form be familiar to everybody. It's something that you can click on, you can see it happen. It feels more like a web page. Than just looking at the command line program itself. To be clear, though, you are not required, as a matter of fact, unless it really, really helps you, don't bother. You are not required to modify this to work with your airline application. The HTML forms are there just as a demonstration for anybody who knows HTML, so that they can, if that helps you approach it, that's great. Helps me demonstrate it, but this is not something that you need to update. It's not something that you'll be submitting, and it's certainly not anything that'll be graded or will, count towards your grade. So, just briefly, so you've got, in addition to the HTML client, you've got this Project 5 class that uses that uses an object called an airline REST client. This is code that comes out of the box, and the whole idea here is that the airline REST client is meant to encapsulate the behavior of interacting with the REST API. So that makes your project it's a nice separation of responsibilities, and we'll see more of this well, certainly on Wednesday and maybe some more tonight, where it encapsulates where Airline REST Client really is responsible for working with the REST API and then providing the Project 4 code with a nice Java API to work over the REST API. I think it'll be much more clear once we actually start seeing the code. So actually, you know what? I wanted to ask another question of everybody. Have you all worked with web stuff before? Is HTTP as far as like a programming concept? Are you familiar with that? Have you encountered that in some of your other classes? Oh, okay, nice. Talk about your network security class. Right. Okay. Okay. Right. Yep. Good. A great example of network layering. Right. Yeah. HTTP, which is nice. I guess is that technically an application level protocol? It's been so long. Okay, but good. We haven't done much with programming yet. Um, oh, TryHack Network Foundation. Oh, neat. Okay, I wasn't familiar with that. So, okay, Deboye, it looks like you've used it too. Yeah.
It was actually for that same class, the
Oh,
network
okay.
security, the networking foundation. Yeah.
Oh, nice, nice, nice. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good. So glad that a couple people have seen it. Um, one other thing I want to stress about this assignment, you're not going to be working with HTML here. This is going to be just sending plain text over. So this is a course in the web. This is a course, this is all about HTTP and REST APIs. Nice. Okay, let's look at the code now. Um, let's see here. Yeah, so I think this is my project. Oh yeah, it's got airline web, although I probably need to reload Maven, yeah, to make it, yep, so that it identifies it. Okay, so here we are in IntelliJ. We're looking at our project, and we've got this airline web project here. And it looks pretty familiar. It's got like, a source directory. It's got target, all this good stuff. Got to sneeze. Apologize, couldn't hit the mute button in time. Um, and it's got if you start looking through it, a lot of things are familiar, right? It's got good source directory. It's got integration tests and unit tests and main code. Awesome. This all looks familiar. So let's see here, main code. Oh yeah, it's got Java code. It's also got something called this web app. And okay, so it's got, yep, my Java package, and it's got, okay, some classes. It's got some REST client and servlet thing we just talked about. And it's got, oh, a pretty printer and text dumper and text parser. But it's also got this web app class, web app directory. I'm not going to go into too much detail because you don't need to mess with any of this stuff. That's one of the nice things about, creating it out of the box. You won't have to, write any of this web application configuration yourself. I did it for you. I talk about it in the lecture a bit. I talk about the web.xml and such, so you can learn more about it. But it's not something you're going to have to mess with. That's something you have to change. As a matter of fact, please don't change it because I don't think it gets submitted. But also here in web app is this index.html. So you can put HTML pages, into your web application, static HTML pages, here in, in the web app directory, and it'll get served appropriately. This ends up being served out of the top level, of the web application. So this is why when you load /airline, it loads that index.html, and here is that index.html. Um, and very, very rudimentary stuff here. But again, not to really go too much into it, and I don't know if you know anything about HTML forms or not. But the whole idea here is that you can have an HTML form that then performs a HTTP GET operation on the flight's sub URL, right? So this is why when you click on, so this is the first HTML form that lists all the word definition pairs. This is why when you click on this submit button, the URL goes from /airline to /airline flights. So what it did is it made an HTTP request off to the web container for /airline/flights. And as we'll see here in a moment, when no arguments are provided to this HTTP GET, it returns um, all of the items in a dictionary. Actually, let's go ahead and look at that code. Now, all that code is here in the airline servlet. So a servlet is an object defined in the Jakarta Servlet API. And so this thing extends the standard HTTP servlet class. And these HTTP servlets are these special objects that know how to respond to HTTP requests. It's actually a pretty nice abstraction where what Jetty provides and what the Servlet API provides are like all these standards, and then you just if you follow all those standards, so if you subclass, their class is like HTTP servlet, and if you follow their rules, poof, you can now write a servlet, a web application that resides inside of Jetty. So you can let other people worry about how to implement the web container. All you can then use all that code, and what you contribute to it is your web application. Um, so this is and so what happens when you run when you start Jetty, it instantiates and you've deployed your web application to Jetty. It creates a new instance of the airline servlet. There's a zero argument instructor that gets invoked by Jetty. And now you've got this object, and this object is the thing here again, is this object right here, this airline servlet object that receives the requests to airline flights. And depending on the HTTP verb that you use, a method like do get or do post or do delete, there's a whole bunch of them, will be invoked on that object. And so this object maintains the dictionary. So the dictionary is just a map of strings to strings. And really, it's this airline servlet object which then holds the dictionary object. And then what the do get and do post methods do is interact with this dictionary object depending on what data is passed from the client. And the way data is passed on the client is in the URL. So for instance, if I look for a definition of Ray, that turns into a GET request for /airline/flights word equals Ray. So as I talk about in the lecture, URLs have this what's called URL query that consists of key value pairs. So this is not to be confused with the dictionary. This is key value pairs that are parameters to to the flight's request. And in this case, the word that you're looking to be defined is ray. And so it then will respond with ray, a drop of golden sun. And that response is computed here in the do get method. So this is the method that is invoked, the method on the servlet, which is invoked when a client makes an HTTP GET request. And it doesn't matter if that client is the web browser or if the client is the command line utility. They both make the same HTTP request. So so I mentioned that the dictionary is stored in this map. And this is just a Java object. And this means that when I stop the servlet, so I'm just going to control C this, and now it's stopped. Now if I try to load the web page, I'll just do a reload here. It says site can't be reached. Yep, that makes sense because it's not running. So I'll run it again. And there it is. But now when I ask for all the word definition pairs, they're all gone because what was stored, it was in volatile memory. Now you can imagine, how to write it out to some persistent storage. That's actually not part of the assignment. So just to be clear, while you will be using the text dumper and the text parser for data exchange between the client and the server, you won't be using it to persist the airline to disk. You've demonstrated that you can do that in projects 2 and 3. You don't need to do it here. You'll actually be doing it in project 5 also in the Android project, but that's for a later day. But for project 4, don't worry about it. I know your text dumper, your text parser work for writing to files. Now you need to use those same classes to write to dump an airline to the client back to the client, and we'll see how to do that shortly and dive into it even more on Wednesday. Oh, actually, something I wanted to do here. So, what I want to do next, I want to walk you through this code, but instead of looking through the code, I want to attach a debugger. A quick poll of folks who are here. Who here has used debugger before? Who's used like a GDB, a command line debugger, right? I think they still have you doing that in the early computer science courses. People have used debuggers before. Yeah, good. Has anybody ever used a visual debugger, like in an IDE, like in Visual Studio, or we're going to use it here in IntelliJ, something where you can, use a richer environment to interact with your running program? Oh, good. Yasmin has. Excellent. Oh yeah, Devoice used GDB before. Okay. Well, excellent. I think so. Conceptually, you understand what a debugger is. Some of you have used a visual debugger. The way it works in Java is the following. The JVM is capable of having a debugger attached to it, but you need to launch it in a certain way. And IntelliJ is a debugger client, which works really well because you can do things like set debugger breakpoints. Actually, I'll do that right now. The way you do that is you click on the line number in the margin, and what that does, it sets a breakpoint, a debugger breakpoint, at that line, meaning that if if IntelliJ is attached to a program that's running in debug mode, then the debugger will stop here at this line and let you inspect everything that's going on. And the way you do that is the following. Um, there's a special kind of configuration that you need to run. Actually, what happens if no, I don't want to do that. If I edit the configurations here and I go to create a new run configuration, and there's one called, I think it's called remote JVM. Yeah, remote JVM debug. What this will do is it will tell IntelliJ to attach to another JVM. So IntelliJ is written in Java. So IntelliJ is a Java VM, and then you can configure it to say, oh yes, attach to another JVM and debug it. In this case, it's going to be, I'm just going to call it localhost 8080. Actually, no, I'm going to call it Jetty server, just to be clear. And let's see here. I want to keep all this configuration. There's a very important thing right here, which is this magical command line for the remote JVM. So when I click on that, I'm going to copy it to the clipboard, and I'm going to do the following. Over here, I'm going to stop my Jetty. Over here in the command line, I'm going to export an environment variable called Maven Ops. And you can do this. I'm going to do, here on my Mac. It's the syntax is this. Um, Actually, all of this comes from if we go and look in let's not do that. Let's do yeah, here. There's a whole section about using the debugger. Let's see here. Sorry, I'm just going to search for it because I can't see it. There we go. How can I use a debugger to uncover the source of problems with my projects? Um, Learning how to use a debugger is a very important skill for a professional software developer. And so I'll show it to you tonight, but I do encourage you to read over this section of the README to learn how to, how to launch a JVM, launch a Java program so that it can be debugged, and then use IntelliJ to attach to the program that's able to be debugged so that it can so you can walk through the code like we see here. So the bottom line here is that if you want to debug a process that is run by Maven, you need to set this Maven underbar ops and Maven options um, uh, environment variable. So either like this on Unix or Linux and Mac and everything like that, or if you're in PowerShell, it's looks like this, or if you're in a Windows command environment, it looks like that. I'm going to be here on Unix. And so I'm going to set Maven ops to the value of this thing that I got out of IntelliJ. So back over here in IntelliJ, I created the remote JVM debug for the Jetty server. I kept all this here. This uses another port. So this 5005 is the debug port, which shouldn't be confused with the HTTP port, which is 8080. Right, we're dealing with a whole bunch of different programs talking to each other in right now, and so this is confusing. And so you need to know who's speaking on which port, who's communicating on which port. So when I click on this, it highlights it so I can copy it to the clipboard. And this kind of magic invocation is a option to the JVM that basically says, "Hey, listen as or listen on port 5005 for a debugger to attach." So I'm going to set that environment variable. And now when I run Maven again, the first thing that you probably it went too fast. The first thing that the JVM output when it was started up is saying, "Oh, I'm listening on port 5005." You'll have to trust me on that one. It went by pretty quickly. So now that I've run my Maven with the Maven ops set, it's running in a debugger mode. And now I can just click debug here, and that attached to it. So now what IntelliJ is doing is IntelliJ has connected to the VM, and whenever that JVM executes a a line of code that IntelliJ knows about, it'll stop. So we're going to do that right now. So I've set this debug breakpoint on the do-get method, which means that whenever the servlet receives a get request, I expect the debugger will stop there. So I'm going to go back to the page here, to the HTML form. I'm going to click list all word definition pairs. Gonna hit submit. And oh, look, when I hit submit, what happened was the request went to the JVM. The JVM, the Jetty. Here, I'll show you again here. Ignore the Project 5 client. I made an HTTP GET request that went to the web container. The airline got routed to the airline web application. The flights part of the URL that got sent to the airline servlet. And since I am invoking HTTP GET, it calls the doGet method. And when it called the doGet method, all of a sudden IntelliJ woke up and said, "Oh my gosh, you're executing a method where there's a breakpoint." It stopped at that breakpoint. So now I'm debugging it. Notice that I guess you can probably see it here, how it's still spinning. That's because the call hasn't returned yet. So the when it called, when the form was submitted and the HTTP URL was requested, the request hasn't been processed yet because now the debugger is paused in the debugger waiting for me to look at stuff. So here's the do get method. Now, doGet takes two objects, an object that represents the request that came in from the client, and a response object that represents whatever goes back to the client. And really, the job of the doGet method is to obtain information from the request, process it appropriately, and then provide result information back in the response. It's very different than just like a regular Java method where there's like parameters that it takes in and then it returns some value. The designers of the API decided not to do it this way. Instead, what they did was they have these two parameters, one which is kind of an incoming parameter and one's an outgoing parameter. Um, and HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response, these are interfaces provided by that servlet API. And so there is an implementation. There is some real object here. As a matter of fact, we'll see what it is shortly. But you don't care. You're just programming to the interface. You just know that the request and the response have certain methods that you need to invoke. And here's the first one. So the first thing that we do in the method is say, hey, listen, the response, the type of data that we're going to be sending back is just plain text. Nothing fancy there. So right now we are waiting on this. What does this do? Resume program. We don't want that. This is just waiting for this method to be executed. And the way we can then step through in the debugger is by using these tools down here. So this is the debug view, which you can access here in IntelliJ. And it's saying, hey, I'm debugging the Jetty server. And right now I am stopped at line 34 of airline servlet. And over here, I can look at the various objects that are in scope. So like this object, which is the servlet itself, it has a dictionary of size 0, okay? And it's got some bunch of other stuff it inherits, but it's not so interesting. And then you can also look at the request object. It tells you the runtime type of the object, which is this internal Jetty class. Great, servlet API request. Sweet. I don't really care what the runtime type of it is. All I know is that it implements the HTTP servlet interface. HTTP servlet request and response interface. So what I can do now is I can step over this method to go to the next line. And that set the content type of the response. That basically says the response, okay, you're getting text to be written back. And this is actually a really important thing in the HTTP protocol. And in that, the client needs to know what type of data it's getting back, right? It could just be plain text. It could be an image. It could be a PDF file, all sorts of things. And so it's really important to specify that. Sorry, it's one more thing, and this is covered in the lectures in much more detail. But one thing I wanted to emphasize is that the HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response interfaces are basically providing a Java interface, a Java API on top of the HTTP protocol. And this makes for much more fluid and fluent development because you're using Java methods on these objects to basically craft the response, to interrogate the request and then craft the response that is sent back. Okay. Um, the semantics of the doGet method are the following. If the word parameter is specified, in this case it is not. I guess we don't really see that yet, but we haven't specified the word parameter because we said, hey, show me all of the dictionary entries. Um, if it's not specified, then we want to write all the dictionary entries. If it is specified, so if the word is not null, then we will write the definition of that word. And so there's this get parameter method, which is here inside in the servlet class, and we can go into it by stepping into it. So we can step into the get parameter method that's being invoked. Here we are in get parameter. We're down to line 156. Get parameter returns the name of the parameter whose value you want to get, and the HTTP request object that actually lets you get at that. And so then request itself has a get parameter method. So I'm going to invoke that, and we'll see. Oops, what did I do? That was interesting. What did I just do there? Did I do? Oh, I did step into instead of step over. I apologize. I'm going to step out of now. Good. It was off in Jetty code land. But now I'm going to call get parameter, and the value that was returned by that was null, which makes sense because word was not specified. As a matter of fact, let's just look at the request. The request has all sorts of interesting information. And like here are the parameters. You can see it's an empty. Um, yeah, it's an empty map. Um, we can also do things, well, I guess we kind of call get parameter right here. But one of the things you can do in the debugger is say evaluate expression. And you can then just type some kind of arbitrary Java code. So you can say get parameters, get parameter names. Oh, get parameter maps, probably interesting. And that returns zero size because there were none of those key value pairs in the query. We'll see an example of this shortly. But here again, this is I mean, I know you can do all this stuff with GDB, but I find it just to be so much more usable to use inside an IDE. And for me, this is one of the really, valuable things that these integrated development environments give you is a really great debug experience. Back to my get parameter method, we'll see that there isn't a value here, and so then we'll just return null. So we'll just step over all this code. We'll return null. Here we are in the calling method back in doGet. Word is null, which means we'll go down here. We'll log the get all dictionary entries string. So there's nothing there. And now once we go log, it just is a simple standard print line. Now it prints the get all dictionary entries. And then it's done. Yeah, okay, now I'm up in a whole bunch of servlet code, so I just want to say continue here. And now it's done, right? There's no other breakpoints that were hit. And now if we go back to our browser, we'll see that okay, this URL did load and there's nothing there. Not terribly interesting. But let's go put something there. And actually I'm gonna go, yeah, I'm gonna go here. And we're just gonna do doe deer female deal, just so we have something. Great, it defined it. Now I'm going to list all the word definition pairs again. I hit the debug breakpoint because the do get method was invoked. Here we're going to see that word is null again. So now we're going to write all dictionary entries, and we're done with that method. So we're going to continue. And now we see though that there was something written there. Oh, I probably should have debugged into that so we can see what happens there. Yeah, actually, I'm going to do that now. So sorry, we're gonna do this again. Actually, I'm just going to reload. I reloaded that tab, and now I'm back in do get. So here I'm going to step over this, but now I'm going to step into the write all dictionary entries. So um, I mentioned before that the text dumper and the text parser aren't used to persist a dictionary in this case, or an airline in your case, not used to persist it to a file, but instead it's used to generate a text data format for exchanging between the client and the server. Um, and so then here's how that works. Um, The HTTP response uh, has a print writer associated with it because the HTTP response is just text that's sent back to the client, and the designers of the servlet API were did something that I think is really quite smart. They needed an object to represent, well, here is the text that is sent back to the client. We need an object that writes text to some destination. Hey, I know, let's reuse the print writer from java.io. So why bother creating a new class when we've got one there in java.io? So from the response, you can get a print writer. Now, as you may recall, a print writer, is just a standard Java.io class that has a print line method in it. And now I can use that in my text dumper. So my text dumper is oh, this might be looking at the wrong one. Yeah, it's the one for Project 2. Sorry, it's not smart to figure out there's a different text number class in the same package for Project 4. So, oops, not terribly interesting there. When the mosquitoes have come out. Um, uh, the whole idea here is that actually we'll go into this one. Yeah. So I just use a text number. As a matter of fact, if you have implemented your text number to take a writer of some sort, here it just takes a generic writer and does some stuff to it. You don't need to change it at all, right? And I hope that and I hope that you see now how by decoupling the text dumper from the destination that it writes to, you've got a lot of power. So, in Project 2, yeah, you're always going to write to a file, but now in Project 4, you're going to write to, well, this print writer associated with a servlet response. And so what the text dumper does in its dump method is it basically iterates over the dictionary that's passed in, and on Wednesday we'll change this into an airline, and then merely dumps out the key value pairs in the dictionary, and that's why here let's just go back to this. That's why what's written to the back to the browser is just that is just that format. Oh, by the way, something important that you want to do is you want to set the HTTP status here at the at the end before you finish the do get method. Everything was okay. This is a nice 200 status code. So this means everybody's okay. You're familiar with like 404, I'm sure, and I discuss a whole bunch of other ones, 500 and all that kind of stuff in the lecture. So after you've done your program logic, which is to, invoke the test dumper to write the contents of a dictionary out to the HTTP response, then you say, great, everything's okay. Got an SCOK, we'll return 200, and then we'll be on our merry way. Yep, and now we're done with the do get method, and so we'll just keep the program running. And as we saw before, it then returns this text format for the for the dictionary. Before I go through the next example, though, I wanted to pause for any discussion that people like to have about what they've seen so far. If there's anything that you'd like me to dive into in greater detail, if there's anything, just anything on your mind. Right. Thanks for waiting, Yasmin. Okay, good. Okay, there's a little bit more code that I want to debug here just to show you more about this servlet. I guess the other thing that I want to do now is I want to go through this other code branch where we write just the definition of a single word. And so that would be actually let me just add another donor array, drop a golden sun. Oops. A drop of golden sun. I'll add a second one. Great. And now I want to define the word ray. So now I'm going to click ray here. Sorry, I'm going to put in ray there and click submit. We're back in the do get method again. So both these first two invoke get APIs. If you went and looked at the source code, or they'll go and look at the NSI HTML source, they both invoke the get method. But now when we look at our request, we'll see that or maybe not. Okay, we will do that. Now I'm gonna where's the request? I'm going to evaluate the expression. I'm gonna say get parameter map. Great. Now it's got one entry in the parameter map, which is word is ray, right? The word that we're looking up is ray. Now the call to get parameter because there is a the rate because the word parameter and that's the word because that query parameter is defined when we call get parameter the value of word oops the value of word is ray and see IntelliJ puts it up here also. Actually, what happens when you click on it? Oh, it just you can drill down into it more, I guess. That's neat. Strings aren't that terribly interesting. But now you can step through this. And so then here the word is not null. And so you're going to log get word. And you're going to go into this, we're going to call this write definition. So let's step into that. And here we go and we get the definition of the word array. And that just looks it up from the dictionary, and now the definition is a drop of golden sun. Now, if there wasn't a definition for it, and if it was null, then we would return a 404. I believe that's 404. Sorry, I'll get this other window out of the way. Come on, babies. Yes, definitely a 404. In this case, it is not null. So when we go talking, yep, we just do this, and then we kind of I don't know we play a little game with the text dumper. We create oops, wrong button. Step over. We create essentially a new temporary um dictionary with one entry in it, and then we dump that out. That way, you're still using the te same text dumper. So that dumps the one dictionary entry there, and then does a result 200, and everybody's happy. So we'll continue on. And then what was ultimately returned to the client is Ray, a drop of golden sun. Is the relationship between the client and the server clicking with you all? Um, I know we all use the web, but I don't know how many of us um have really sort of experienced it in this way and sort of from an implementation standpoint as opposed to just using it as a client. But I just wanted to do a check to see how people are feeling and thinking about the way the data is being passed back and forth between the web browser and and the server and the servlet. Hmm. Looks like folks are grokking it so far. That's good. Feel free though to speak about it any time if there's something that isn't making sense. So that was basically the logic of the get method. And I can just quickly walk through the logic of the post method. So this is the thing that actually creates the key value pair, or sorry, the word dictionary relationship in the application. And here I'm going to invoke this one. So this is what's invoked actually when you do this submit right here. Um, that takes the post path. But I'm also going to show you that you can, you invoke it here on the command line, and you'll get the same code being executed. So I'm going to invoke this on the command line here, and now I'm in the do post method. So when I want to create the relationship between a word and its definition, then that's done in a post. And so just like in the get, the first thing you do is say, hey, here's the type of data that I'm going to return, and so it's going to be plain text. And we're going to once again, I'm going to start using keyboard shortcuts. Thank you. Make sure I got the right ones though. That is F8. Yeah. Um, we once again get the word parameter, and the word here is me. If that was null, then I would issue a missing required parameters. Uh, oh yeah, issue a missing required parameters error, which maybe I can get to happen. We'll come back to that. Then I will get the definition. And again, if it's missing, then I will issue an error. And by the way, issuing an error here means just you can use the send error method, which has a HTTP error code, 412 in this case, along with a message. But I have a valid word and a valid definition, so I'm going to log that. Oops, just by doing system.out.println. And then I'm going to get the print writer for the from the HTTP response, HTTP servlet response, and then I'll just print out this message defined as words. I'll flush the stream. I'll say, yep, everything's okay because I successfully, um, oh yeah, I'm back here in Jetty land. Because I successfully handled the do post. I successfully handled the post request. Oops. Okay, I guess there it is. This is the information that came back. Define me as a name I call myself. That's neat. And then let's see here. I'm going to do the following. Now let's see them all again. I'm tired of debugging this, so actually I think I'm done debugging this for now. So what I can do is detach from the well, it says stop Jetty server, but this is the same thing as detaching. It basically detach. You don't actually stop the server. You detach from the process. And now it's disconnected. Now I'm not running it anymore, and it automatically returns. And since I'm not debugging, it'll just return automatically. It doesn't stop the world in the debugger. So that was a lot right there. That was an introduction to servlets and debugging. Two great tastes that go great together. But we've got this servlet object which responds to the HTTP requests. So either HTTP get in the do get method, and it's got the logic there for performing different operations depending on what parameters were provided. And same thing with do post. So this is, the behavior of do post is that it creates a new association between a word and its definition. And so it needs to get the word, needs to get the definition, and then it'll make the definition. And notice it does put it in the dictionary. So this is the thing that actually, populates the dictionary, keeps track of it, and then it has a return message, a status message, if you will, that is returned there. By the way, if I leave this empty, sorry, I guess it returns all of them. If I leave this empty though, yeah, okay, the required parameter word is missing. I guess what doesn't show is that it doesn't show that the HTTP error code is like a 412 or something like that. I don't think I can create the situation from the command line though. Okay, oh, I know what I could do though. I could say empty string, but that'll work. Yep. That returns HTTP status code 412, and the required parameter word is missing, which is exactly the same error message that was returned here. So that is a quick introduction to the servlet and what it does. Is there anything else I can tell you about that? Okay. I'm guessing not. That was a lot. I think it's time for a break. Lots of talking. I need to go put some bug spray actually. And so then, hey, let's take 10 minutes and be back at 7:18, and we'll talk about how to unit test the servlet. Some kind of cool stuff might blow your mind, but it's really important to this web project. So I'm looking forward to that next. See you in 10. Okay, welcome back. So let's see here. In the first half, well, we've been talking all about Project 4, which is the REST API project. And we were focusing after we saw like how the client and the server interact with each other, we dove into the details of the implementation of the server, which really revolves all around this airline servlet object. And we used a Java debugger to walk through these out of the box implementations of the do get and do post method, which implement this very simple uh, dictionary application. And as you saw, when the servlet is run inside of a Jetty web container, as we depict here in this architectural diagram, uh, it's the thing that receives the it receives any HTTP request that for a resource that is /airline/flights. And that's how the do get and do post methods are invoked depending on the HTTP verb that's used here. So that's the way the servlet behaves, when it runs inside a web container. And the logic of the logic of our program is implemented inside do get and do post inside these methods. And you know me, I'm a big fan of testing your logic. We want to make sure that our programs behave as expected. And as you can see, working with the servlet, from with Jetty running, can be done, but there's a lot of back and forth. And you can imagine as you're developing it, having to like reload Jetty all the time every time you make a code change, that can be slow. And what you really like to be able to do is write some unit tests for this, right? Because at the end of the day, this is just a Java object, right? There's really nothing terribly special here. It's just a Java object, and it's meant to run inside a servlet. But if you can get it to run outside of a servlet, can you write a unit test for it? And so then, you can imagine your unit test is something along the lines of, okay, I create a airline servlet object and I want to invoke its do get method so I can test the logic that's here inside do get. But if I look at the signature of the do get method, I've got this HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response. And if I go and look at these interfaces here, there's all sorts of stuff. There's all these methods. And ultimately, when it comes down to it, I need to in my unit test, I'll need to pass a real instance of HTTP servlet request and HTTP servlet response to the do get method. Now, this can all be done, right? As part of your test, you could write your own implementation of HTTP servlet request that behaves the way that you want it to. Same thing with HTTP servlet response, and then you could, basically provide an HTTP servlet request that would have the parameter that you want so that when get parameter is invoked on a request, it would return the parameter that your test expects. And then you could, interrogate the response object after it's been interacted with by do get to, make sure that it was that the response that you expected was returned. That's a lot of code. So there is this um, there is this testing technique called using mock objects. And what a mock object is an implementation of an interface that has what I call programmable behavior. This is described in all sorts of detail in the testing with mock objects screencast, and I really encourage you to take the time to watch this to really understand what mock objects are all about. It's an advanced topic, no question. And it's something that, and actually the Mockito framework that we use, there's a lot of magic there. It does some really cool things. But at the end of the day, it's very powerful and allows you to write unit tests, true unit tests for code like your servlet, because what you can do is interact with the code under test, in this case your servlet, with mock objects. And here's an example of how to do that. So I want to create a test that says, hey, initially a servlet contains no dictionary entries, meaning that when I go and I do a HTTP get, or when I call the do get method on a brand new airline servlet, then nothing is written to the print writer associated with the response, and the HTTP return code, status code, is 200. Here's how I can express that using mock objects. So I create the code that's under test. It's actually a real object. There's no mocking going on here. So the airline servlet, I just create a new airline servlet. That is the object that I want to test. And ultimately, I want to invoke the do get method of that servlet with a request and a response. I know because Java, has strong types, I need to provide an object that implements the HTTP servlet request um, interface, and object that implements the HTTP servlet response interface. So I get these two variables, request and response. But when I create them, I use this mock method that comes from this API called Mockito. This is a testing API that makes mock objects out of interfaces and other things as well. And so I say, hey, give me a mock instance of the HTTP servlet request class. And so then we use our old friend .class, right? We use the reflection API to get a reference to this class. And this mock magic, this mock method is, I mean, it's really magic. It creates like this. I want to go into all implementation now, but what you have is an object which actually is an HTTP servlet request. You can invoke methods on it. You can, interact with it. Um, it's not going to know a difference. And so I'm going to have the request. I'm going to do the same thing with the response. Now, if you look at as you recall, the do get method in a method like write all dictionary entries, it it calls the get writer method on the response. Now, Makito, by default, because it doesn't know any better, every one of the get methods, or every method that returns a value in the mock object will return null. That's just what it does out of the box. And if you want to do something different, then you need to basically tell it what to do. So in this case, what I want to do is I want to say, well, when getWriter is returned on my mock response, I want to return a mock print writer. I don't want to return null, because if I do return null, then I'll get a null pointer exception when I try to use this PW. I don't want a null pointer exception. What I want is, well, something that behaves well enough like a print writer. As a matter of, and these mock objects, they said if the mock object, the methods of a mock object that return a value or return null or the zero equivalent or whatever, and anything that has a void return type will just basically be a no op. It won't do anything unless you tell it to do something different. And you can tell it to do something different by using this when method. So this is another piece of Makito magic. And it basically has the following. Hey, listen, when the getWriter method is invoked on my mock response object, then return my mock print writer object. And so what this is doing is using this Mockito API to basically create these mock objects and then program them to behave a certain way. And you just need to program them well enough to really make your test work the way you'd expect it to. So then I can call do get, give it my mock, and give it my mock request, mock response. And the thing I love so much about this is because all the mock objects implement these interfaces, your code under test is really none the wiser. It doesn't care that what's passed into it is a real, HTTP server request that comes from Jetty or a mock HTTP server request that comes from Mockito. All it knows is it's got some HTTP server requests, and it will interact with it appropriately, right? It'll call set content type on the response. It will use the get parameter method to go and get the method, go get the parameter, the value of the parameter, et cetera, et cetera. So, oops, yeah. So now you can just do and go and call it. Now, you can call this response if there aren't any API. Sorry, if there aren't any exceptions being thrown, then it'll return. This is normal. But what you want to do now is check the side effects of calling the doGet method. You want to make sure that the behavior of the doGet method with respect to the expected interactions that the interactions that you expected to have with the request and more importantly the response objects um, actually happen. And so you can do that by using the verify method for Mockito. So this is kind of an interesting variation on arrange act assert, where it's like what you're doing is you are setting up these mock objects and sort of like putting them all together, and then you are invoking the code under the test, and now you are asserting things about this. It doesn't use the word assert; it uses the word verify instead. And so it's saying the following. Listen, it's saying that I'm going to verify that the print line method of the print writer object is never invoked. Now, this syntax is a little weird, but that's how you read this. And you can, again, if you go and study the Mockito API or the Mockito lecture, this will become more natural to you. But basically, it's saying, listen, when there aren't any dictionary entries, then nothing is ever written to the print writer. And the way that you assert that is you say, hey, listen, make sure that again, the print line method doesn't matter what's sent to it. Any string can be sent to it. Make sure that's never invoked. probably easier to understand is the following. You say, hey, listen, verify that the set status method of the response object is invoked with the value scok, which is 200. And so when you run this, it passes. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of warnings here about Mockito maybe not being supported in the future, but that future hasn't come yet. Um, and that's because this actually works, right? The Mockito API creates these mock objects, and it when the code under test actually calls get writer, then it returns this mock print writer, and then you can verify that yes, the print writer was never the print line method was never invoked. The set status was invoked with 200. And what this allows you to do then is write unit tests for your servlet. Your servlet, which is expected to be, which usually runs, or at least in production, runs inside this web container. You don't need the web container. You don't need to start up Jetty. You don't need to, call HTTP. You don't need to make HTTP requests. Instead, you can treat the airline servlet as the Java object that it actually is. Before I go and look at another example of a unit test, though, I wanted to ask what you think. And how this resonates with you in terms of a testing technique. Oh, yeah, Yasmin. Sounds like it makes integration testing simpler. Um, can you say a little bit more about that statement? Like what prompted you to make that observation? I wish the Zoom chat let me know that if Yasmin is actually typing something or if she's say. Well, I think you make a very good point about integration testing and unit testing. We'll see later tonight. Oh, okay, there you go. Think about okay, see, I'm not sure how to word it exactly. I'm thinking about it. But I have a mock object specifically for testing where you can have details exactly what you are and aren't looking for. That's exactly it, Yasmin. Yep. Yes. You don't have to set the whole program. You don't need to like have a Jetty server actually running. Later tonight, we'll see that you can have an integration test with the Jetty server running. And then that's where you actually invoke, real HTTP calls, which is kind of complex in and of itself. Yeah, the nice thing about this is that it allows you to get everything working at the unit level, and then the integration tests uh, don't need to be so thorough because you've already got the code coverage, you've already got the behavior exercised at the unit level, and then yeah, lets you focus on the things that really deserve and require an integration test. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Great observation. So this was a unit test that just make sure that yes, when you do get an empty servlet or a brand new servlet, you get an empty dictionary. Here is I'll make this a little bigger so we can see. Here's a test for do post. And here we're just making sure that after we add a word to the dictionary that it's is actually stored and persisted. So this one's more involved because it's more involved because we need to set up more things in our mock objects, right? Because when we are defining a word, we're adding a word to a dictionary, we need to specify what the word is and what the definition is. So we're going to start with our test data. We're going to create a new servlet. We're going to say the word that we want to define is this. The definition we want to define is that. We have our mock request, and now we need to tell that mock request how to behave when it is asked for the value of the word parameter and the definition parameter. And the way you do that is with a when, and you say, great, when the get parameter method of the request is called with the value word parameter, this is just the string word, then return the value word. This is kind of, I don't know, every time I look at this, I'm like, I can't believe this works. This is just so cool, right? The fact that with just a couple of simple method calls, you can have this, fairly easy to understand syntax for programming this mock object right here. So this is how we specify that, listen, when the code under test, when do post calls get parameter with the value word, then return this test word. Same thing with our test definition and the definition parameter. Now we're going to set up our response. Now, for our response, we want to capture the text that is written back in the response. And we saw in the previous example how you can set up a mock print writer here so that when you call response to get writer, you'll get a mock print writer. But actually here we want kind of a real print writer. We want a print writer that will capture and eventually give us access to the text that was written. And actually, you can use standard Java I/O objects to do this. So what you do is you create a real print writer that's wrapped around a string writer. And as you may recall, a string writer is just a writer interface that writes to a string, basically buffers it up in memory. Um, and we wrap a print writer around that, and we say, well, that's the print writer that we want to return when the getWriter method is invoked on our mock response. So this is the cool thing about Mockito, right? I mean, you can specify whatever value you want to be returned here. And when the getWriter method is invoked by the doPost method, what will be returned is this print writer that we want for our test that then writes to a string writer. So we've set up our request, set up our response, and now we'll actually make the test. So we'll call a doPost with that request and that response. So we want to then, now that we've successfully returned from doPost, we want to make sure that it has the side effects that we want. So we want to make sure that the string that was written to the string writer contains that defined word as message for that word and that definition. We also want to do what we do up here is validate that the status code is SCOK. And I take a different approach to it here in the second one, just as an example of something called this argument captor. So an argument captor is a way for the test to get at a value that was passed to a method in a mock object. In particular, what we want to say is like, hey, verify that yes, set status was invoked on the response object. And then whatever value was sent to the set status method, please capture that into this status code variable, which is again one of these argument captors. And then we're just going to use a plain old assert that because we can get the value from the argument captor and assert that it equals to SCOK. And oh, look, we're using Hamcrest again for assert that. Actually, we use it up here too. So this is kind of a nice combination of using Mockito for mock objects and then using assert that for richer assertions, right? Yeah, you can use things like contain string, and then you can also, get better error messages when things fail. Additionally, I also want to make sure that the dictionary object inside the servlet has the word defined. So now I can say, hey, servlet, give me the definition. And actually, this method is simply just, return dictionary.getWord. Yep. Make sure that, yes, it was actually defined inside the servlet. So this is actually this get definition is visible just for testing, right? The application itself doesn't really use it. I suppose it could. But we have it mainly there for testing. And it's perfectly valid to do that, right? You've got some piece of functionality that just makes it easier to write your tests. Okay, go ahead and do that. Annotate it with visible as testing to make your intent clear that this is not something that's meant to be used for everybody. It's used primarily for testing. So this method right here, there are no mock objects involved, right? It's the real servlet and the word and the definition. This other stuff you had to work with mock objects because again, the nature of the servlet API is to take in this request object and kind of send back this response object. And again, when you run all this stuff, it passes, because you have, set up your your mock objects to behave in the way that you expect. They expect them to be interacted with by the doPost method. Before we move on to the next topic, though, is there anything else I can tell you about what we've seen in the last few minutes in terms of mock objects and unit tests for the servlet? Okay, so so far we've been focusing on everything over here on the right, on the airline servlet inside the container. I think you've got hopefully you've got a good understanding of sort of all that code. There's a whole bunch of other code in this application, namely stuff over here on the left, the airline REST client and the Project 4. So that's a typo. Project 4 main program. And let's look at that now, because I think this is another interesting example of code that we can sort of factor and decouple appropriately to make sure that objects do one thing and do thing well. So let's look at this project 4. Now, Project 4 is the command line your command line program has got a main, and it's super simple, right? There are four arguments, two of which are required, and so it's like host name, port name, host name, port, word, and definition. And command line parsing again is very simple. It goes through the argument list and will fill in all those values and does a little bit of error checking here. Make sure that the port is an integer. But okay, so this command line parsing, you all know how to do that. You've gotten very good at it in your projects 1, 2, and 3. Now it goes off, and the main program uses this airline REST client class. As I said, the idea of the airline REST client is that it encapsulates all the logic for invoking the REST API for making those HTTP calls. And what it does, it provides a Java interface on top of it, a Java way of interacting with those REST APIs. Because you invoke a REST API by loading a URL, right? And so you got to find the Java API for the URL class, get the URL connection, and this is all detailed in the lecture. But it's stuff where you don't want all that in your main method, right? That would get really in your main method or even your main class. That would get that would get kind of complex, and it would be more difficult to test if all of this stuff was inline. So I think from a design perspective, it's a good thing to separate all of that capability into its own class. So, and the client is interacted with in a couple of ways. So, when you create a client, you create it on a host name, on a given port, and then there's some logic with regards to the parameters that were passed out of the command line. Sorry, the arguments that were passed out of the command line. If the word is missing, this means print all the word definition pairs. And so then we call this method called get all dictionary entries. And this is the thing that we'll ultimately call that HTTP GET with just the airline flights that'll return everything. And so then the object returned by this, though, is a map of strings to strings. So we'll see how this does this. But the idea here is that, when you're dealing with a dictionary, this is really like the type of the dictionary that you want. It's a map of string of strings. On Wednesday, we will evolve, these methods to use an airline instead of a dictionary. But this is the domain class. This is the thing that we work with in our program. And then when we the semantics of the command line is that when you're asked to print all the word definition pairs, you pretty print them. And so there's a class called pretty printer, which is just kind of like your pretty printer that prints out a human readable format for the dictionary. Again, it's just like your pretty printer for your airline. And so again, the main method delegates out to Pretty Printer to go off and dump the dictionary. It dumps it to a string writer just so we can have a message that gets printed out regardless. So there, the message is the contents, the pretty format of the dictionary. Um, that comment is misleading. That's not print all dictionary entries. That should be print the dictionary entry for the word. And here what we do is we call again on the client, on the REST API client, we call the get definition method and provide it the word whose definition we're looking to get. And so this encapsulates the get definition method, encapsulates everything it takes to go off and make the HTTP call, format the response, and find the string that we want and return it. And then I don't know, we call format dictionary entry from the pretty printer, just so that we can, so we can make it look nice to read it. Otherwise, if both word and definition are provided, this is where we add the word definition to the dictionary, and we use we use the add dictionary entry method on the client. We provide the word and the definition, and as we'll see in a couple of minutes, what this thing does is it creates the HTTP post request with the appropriate data for word and definition, and then processes the results that come back from the server. And that's it. So the idea here is that we've actually kept this pretty simple, all things considered, because there's so much of the heavy lifting is delegated to these methods um, of the dictionary of the airline REST client. Of course, some things go wrong, so we're gonna handle the exceptions appropriately. But then, print out the whatever message that we get. So either the successful message, well, I guess they're all successful. Of all the dictionary entries of the definition for a particular word, or just a confirmation that yes, the word was successfully defined. But that keeps our main method nice and focused, I guess is the word that I'll use. Because here again, it's, really it should, the main method, the main class, it needs to know how to parse the command line, and it needs to know how to output things, to the user through out, but then everything else, it should defer that to another object so that it's its mission is clear, so it has appropriately again focused capabilities, and so that we can make it easier to test the airline REST client. So let's look at the airline REST client class. Um, okay, so airline REST client uses a class called HTTP request helper, which is actually something that I've written. It's not here. The source code isn't in here. It's in with my examples um, uh, jar file. And this is the thing that basically gives you that handles all of the creation of the URL connection and making the HTTP request, processing the results. And the intent here is that it makes it easier to work with, so you don't have to because those URL connection APIs are pretty low level, all things considered. The intent here is that this is meant to help. I hope it does. And so then the airline REST client has one of these HTTP request helpers that does, again, it does some heavy lifting too. So as you can see, we kind of have this successive object composition of having, your main method use the REST client, which then uses the HTTP request helper to handle all the different levels of abstraction. HTTP request helper is created from, well, a URL. And so then here it's the HTTP URL with this is the host name, and this is the port, and then you've got, the web app, which is flight, and then the servlet, which is flight. Sorry, airline is the name of the web app, and flights is the name of the servlet. And this is basically, right, the URL that you're going to fetch, from the browser, right? It's this guy right here, airline flights. And we'll come back to this in a little while to see how we can use this parameter, we can use this constructor for testing. But now here's all of the yeah, here's the methods of this. Here's how they're implemented. Most of the yeah, so all the methods will do something with the HTTP request helper. So there's a get method on HTTP request helper that performs a get operation on the URL, and it provides it a map of the key value pairs, which are the query parameters. Here, get all dictionary entries has no query parameters. We just send in an empty map. And the get method actually returns instances of this response class. This is a class that I wrote that contains things like the HTTP status code, what was the string content, how many lines were there. And it's the thing that knows, again, how to like create itself from an HTTP URL connection function. I didn't want you to have to write all of this. I'll take care of this stuff. I want you to really focus on um, working with the REST API, not so much like the low level moving bits back and forth. So we go and get a response object by calling get. And if it's not HTTP, if it's not an HTTP 200 response, if it's not okay, then it will throw something called a REST exception with the code and the message. So, when it comes to conveying errors in Java, one of the first things that we learned is that the way you do this is with an exception. Because you have a unexpected situation and exceptions are objects, and so they can encapsulate information about what went wrong, such as the HTTP error code, HTTP status code that you got, and any message that was sent back from the server. Oops. But if we're successful, if we did get an HTTP status code of 200, then what are we going to do? Well, we're going to get the content of the response. And as you may recall, and I'll go back and look at the servlet, when you invoke do get and the word is null, then we write all the dictionary entries using the text dumper. So that's what's written back to the print writer as was delivered to the client. And in here in the airline REST client, the content that's written back is that representation, that the text representation of the dictionary from the text dumper. And so we're going to create a string reader around that string, get content returns a string, and we're going to send it to our text parser. And our text parser knows how to convert that text into ultimately a dictionary, a map of string to strings. And there's another piece of code that will turn into an airline on Wednesday. But hopefully these concepts are familiar to you, right? Text parser, just like the text parser that you're writing for Project 2. And really that's it. So here again, we have a nice focus method that delegates the heavy lifting of calling the REST API off of this general purpose HTTP request helper. It returns this response. Doesn't really know anything about the response, but that's okay. This, the get all dictionary entries knows about how to interpret the response. It goes and gets the text, it sends it to the text parser, and then it parses it as a dictionary and returns that dictionary. So do you see how this is providing like a very nice level of abstraction over all this low level communication between the client and the server? Um, for me, this makes the code easier to understand, to reason about, and as we'll see in a moment, easier to test. So that was the get all dictionary entries, method, and that basically is the same thing as clicking this button, right? It goes and gets all the dictionary entries. Get definition, well, it's the same thing as clicking this button. So when we say, doe, and we click submit, we get a deer, female deer. This is the same thing as saying get definition of doe. So what do we do? Well, we're going to make an HTTP get request. And we're in the query parameters, we're going to say the word that we want to get is doe. That'll be passed in here, it would be doe. And so we use HTTP get again, but now the map that we send in has it has the one word parameter defined as the word that was that you're looking for here. We go off and make that request. The response object is returned. If there is a problem with the response object, then we'll throw an exception. If not, we'll go and get the content. And this is again, it's a text dumped format of the word and definition. And again, we will turn it into we'll use a text parser to convert that into a dictionary. And because we just want the definition, we will say, get me the definition of the word from the dictionary returned by parsing. And here again, this isn't like a very big method, but yet it does some important stuff and encapsulates some behavior. And finally, add dictionary. This one is actually even simpler. You add you want to specify both the word and the definition. This is, of course, the equivalent of this. Fa, long, long way to run. Long, long way to run. Yep. And here we pass in the word and its definition, and we basically need to make a post now. So we use the HTTP helper to make a post to the URL. And we have both, the map is, with this word and this definition. And here, the response doesn't really contain much of anything. As you may recall, I think all we do is, sort of send back a message. Not terribly interesting. So we don't do anything with the content that comes in a response, but we still check to make sure that we didn't get a HTTP error code. Oops. And this is how this works. And as you'll recall, actually, yeah, right here, when we sent an empty string here, it was the server that then complained that the word parameter was missing because, well, an empty string is the same as a missing parameter in this case. And what did we get? Well, we got a REST exception, which is exactly what is thrown by this throw exception if uh, not okay HTTP status. So because we got, when we put in an empty string for both the name and the definition, because we got a status code 412, so it does not equal okay, so 412 was our code, we then went and got the content that was returned by the HTTP request and used it to create a REST exception. And the REST exception had, code 412, and then the message that came back was the required parameter word is missing. So that's what this thing is all about. So the airline REST client again delegates off this HTTP request helper to make the HTTP request and read back the response. But then each one of these methods knows how to interpret that response, knows what to do with the content that's returned, knows how to interpret the status code, things like that. Any questions come to mind about the airline REST client? I want to talk about how to test it next, but before I do that, though, are there any sort of fundamental curiosities that you have about the airline REST client, what it does, and how it does it? Okay. So, as you'll probably agree, this is kind of a complex class. It does like a whole bunch of stuff. It interacts with this URL. It like, deals with like this content response and, it has to, invoke this text parser and stuff. There's a bit here and it warrants a unit test. But oh my gosh, it makes an HTTP call. And can you really do that in a unit test? Well, yes, you can with mocks. So let's see how Mockito is applied to the unit test for the airline REST client. For the airline REST client, we mock out the HTTP request helper, right? There's not actually this test run doesn't require that a web container be running. Instead, what we do is we mock out the interaction with the web container, and that allows us to validate all this other logic that happens after you call get or after you call post, right? That will, this is we're really because we're mocking out what this get method, what the call to the .get method does. We can then focus on validating this other code, which is fine because this is the code that we wrote, right? I mean, this is just reusing one of my other using my class, and so then, oops, if soon we'll get out of my way here. We look at airline REST client. And so what do we do? So what we want to do is we want to make sure, or basically what we're testing is that when I interact with one of the methods from the REST client, that the appropriate HTTP request is made. So then I'm going to say the following. Okay, I want get all dictionary entries performs HTTP get with no parameters. And so, Gray, I'm going to create a dictionary here. And what I'm going to do is I'm basically going to mock out the situation where there is a valid dictionary that's been populated with two words, one with the number one and two with the number two. And so the way I do that is I say the following. Well, listen, I'm going to create a mock HTTP request helper. And when the get method of my mock HTTP request helper is invoked with an empty map, and so you have to use the equal for the equal EQ for the to say equals to. Then I'm going to return, well, the text version of this dictionary. And this basically uses the text number to mock all this stuff out. Because this is exactly what the servlet does. See what you're able to do here? I mean, you're able to pretend to interact with a servlet through this mock object. And as long as the mock object behaves the same way that your servlet does, it's a valid test. It's going to test it's the same thing as testing the servlet, in production and actually running. So now I've got my mock HTTP request helper. And so what I'm going to do, well, I'm just going to really just, invoke the code. I'm going to create a new airline REST client from that. And I'm going to call get all dictionary entries, which was, as you may recall, returns a map of strings. And we're going to say, hey, listen, I expect that the dictionary returned by get all dictionary entries has the same entries is equal to the test dictionary that I'm using here. And note that, this dictionary gets turned into text essentially and then back again. And then what this does is, validates the logic of my get all dictionary entries method. Might seem a little contrived, but if you think it through, it's valid. And what it ends up doing is, validating all of this logic here. Now, granted, there's only 3 lines, but still, it validates the logic that's there in that method. Your airline code might be more complex. I don't know. Maybe we'll get a hint of that on Wednesday. But the bottom line here is that this is another example of using mock objects. And because here we can, instead of mocking out the HTTP servlet request or HTTP servlet response, both of which are kind of complex objects, they got a lot of methods on them. There's a lot of different, stuff to model. Here we can just use the mock and focus in on the behavior that we want, which is return, the text value of that dictionary, of this test dictionary, when the get method is invoked with an empty map. And Wednesday we might be writing some more tests for the airline REST client. We'll see how far we get. So you've seen mock objects again. You've seen this Mockito API again. If you'd like to discuss any new observations, perspectives, or questions that have popped up now that you've seen Mockito again. Okay. So we've seen that we can use Mockito to write unit tests for our servlet, for our REST client. And these are great because these are unit tests. These run independently of the web container. We don't need to have the web container running. They can be super fast. We can use them to validate the logic of our code relatively easily. Yeah, there's a learning curve with Mockito. You'll experience it yourself. Go back, watch the lecture, review what we did here. Please, of course, ask questions on Slack. But it can be done, and that's very valuable to be able to have unit tests for this stuff. But as I think it was Yasmin who was saying before, it's like, oh, integration tests, you do want to be able to exercise your servlet in running in Jetty just to make sure everything works. And you do want to be able to invoke to exercise your main method, or invoke the REST the REST airline REST client, um, not just with the mock HTTP, but with a real HTTP request helper that goes out and makes the REST API calls against the running servlet. And you can do that in integration tests. And so here we have a series of three integration tests. We'll ignore the index.html. One for project 4, one for the REST client, and then one for index.html. These methods actually will go and call the REST APIs. So I'm gonna run this one right now. We'll walk through this one in a second. They all pass because the Jetty is running over here. If I go and quit Jetty and I run them, they all fail because a connection was refused, meaning it tried to make it tried to connect to Jetty and it wasn't there. So so in order for these to run, Jetty must be running. If you look at the unit tests, like airline REST client, you run those without Jetty, and they all pass because they're not actually invoking the servlet because they're using mock objects and all of this stuff. So, sorry, is it running now? No, I need to run it now. Okay, so I'll run it, and and now we'll see the test pass. So what do these tests do? Well, actually not that much. Um, So like this first one sets the stage by removing all the dictionary entries. I didn't really talk about this very much, but the for testing purposes, the servlet has supports do delete, and that will delete all of the entries in the dictionary. Again, it's useful for testing for testing. It's not something that is graded, so you can implement it if you want if it helps you test, but you don't have to. Now let's look at the other tests here. Here, I'm just going to say, yeah, great. Empty server contains 0 dictionary entries. And so then I'll create a new airline REST client. And actually, let's take a look at that. Basically, I've got the host name and the port. And so what do I do? Well, I just create a new airline client with the host name and with that port. So I create the client. I get all the dictionary entries. This will actually go off. This is the real live code, right? No mock objects here anymore. This will go off and make the HTTP request using the HTTP request helper, and it'll return like the real result. And sure enough, we want to make sure that it's that's equal to 0. And again, and actually, maybe if I made it a little, see here, can I do a split screen here? Maybe if I minimize this. I'll make this even more narrow because what I want you to see is that this actually invokes stuff on the server. So you'll see some output over on the right. Yep, there was a bunch more. Sorry, just once more with feeling. Yep, it spit out a couple of things. So the idea here is this isn't smoke and mirrors. This is actually invoking the servlet that runs inside of Jetty. And it does this by invoking the REST airline client. So this gives you confidence that yes, the client will actually run when Jetty is running, not just in the mocked out environment that we saw in the unit test, which is very helpful, but this just gives you further confidence. And you can go through all the use cases. You can define one word, again, by using the add dictionary entry. Then you can go and get a definition of that word, from the servlet again. And oh yeah, here's a good example of making sure that that if you attempt to add a dictionary with an empty name and an empty definition, this is actually just the same case that we did here, right? Where it's empty, empty. We have an integration test for this where we send in empty, empty, and we should get back a REST exception that has a HTTP 412, and then it has this error message, missing required parameter. So we can validate all of this stuff in our integration tests. But as I said at the very beginning of class, these to me seem like real integration tests in that they depend on this other component running, depend on Jetty running. Because again, one more time, if Jetty isn't running, then everything failed because it's not able to make a connection. Um, there is a similar test oh, actually, so there's one more thing about this I wanted to point out. Um, the order in which these tests are invoked is important. For instance, you want to make sure that the server is empty, it has been emptied by removing all of them before, validating that empty server contains no dictionary entry. So you got to make sure that this test zero, is invoked before test one. And the way I did that is I used this annotation from JUnit that you probably haven't seen before called test method order. And you can say order the methods by their name. And now you can have test zero, test one, test two. I think there's other ways of doing this. This is the way I like to do it. It seemed to work the best here. Must have been a test three at some point, and I deleted it. But anyway, that's how you make sure that they're invoked in order because these tests have side effects, right? They leave data around. So, so for instance, let me run this. Okay, so it's running. Let me run it one more time. Everything passed. Uh, sorry, wait a second. I want to show something first. I'm gonna restart it again. So I restart Jetty. There are no flights in there. I run the tests. Not flights. Yeah, well, there are flights, there are dictionary entries. And now if I load it again, oh yeah, the test data is left over. So this is an important thing, especially with integration tests. There are side effects and they outlive the test. You're used to unit tests, which are being very idempotent, right? They create their own data. It's usually just some object that only lives the lifetime of that test. Well, here, because the Jetty server outlives the tests that are run, the data is still around. So that's why it's so important to have to clean up everything in this test zero before doing any other work. So there's the airline REST client. There's also the Project 4 integration test. And here it sort of does some similar things. Oh yeah, it removes all the mappings. It just uses the REST API client to do it. But the rest of it uses invoke main, right? It's our old friend. And so then, here is where you can test the main method. And you do this just like you've been doing, invoke main since project one, right? So you can say, listen, when I invoke main with no command line arguments, yep, you have whatever's written to standard error contains the string missing command line arguments. And the same thing that, listen, you've got an empty server, and so then, yep, you have a successful invoke main, but nothing is written to standard error, and what's written to standard output is this format word count of zero, et cetera, et cetera. And here's, we test that we yeah, we should get an uncaught exception in main because uh it's got no definition. Right, right, right. So there's no definition for the word yet, et cetera, et cetera. So as I hope you can see, even though this code is, an order of magnitude more complex than what you've been working with so far, it can still be tested. You can still apply the same good programming principles that you've been exploring in the first three projects in this project itself. And I think this is, part of the challenge of it is to understand how you can have automated validation for this this code, which is much more complex and much more interesting. Finally, I want to show off the fact that when you run Maven Verify, the um, the pom.xml for this project is configured to launch Jetty, deploy the application before it runs any of the integration tests. So just like in your projects 1, 2, and 3, you can run Maven Verify to run all of your tests, both unit tests and integration tests. It'll all work. And just like projects 1, 2, and 3, there is a code coverage requirement that will require you to I think very likely have both unit and integration tests for your servlet and for your airline REST client and for your Project 4 main program. So I want to pause there for any final thoughts on what you've seen tonight. I know it was a lot. And I know we kind of started over from scratch, and you're seeing a lot of new concepts, everything from servlets to web containers to data being passed and forth between a client and a server. But are there any initial topics that come to your mind that you want to spend just another minute or two exploring, um, to make sure that you can walk away from tonight with enough understanding so that you can re-engage again on Wednesday? Oh, okay. With that, I just want to give a preview of what we're going to cover on Wednesday because it really is a sequel to what it is we talked about tonight. Tonight was all about this out of the box airline application. The dictionary application. And it's nice and simple, and I hope that it made sense to you. But it's not where you need to end up, right? Ultimately, you need to be modeling airlines in your servlet. You need to, and we'll talk more about this in detail on Wednesday as we dive really into the meat of the assignment. But what you'll be doing is returning all the, when you do an HTTP GET, it'll return all the flights in a given airline using text dumper. So your text number, your text format, it'll go over the wire. And that means that your airline REST client will have to parse that and return an airline to the main method, to the project for class. And there's a delta to go from what you've got today to that. And I'm going to get you started on that. So we can see more refactoring, so you can just get more used to writing and evolving tests, both unit and integration tests for the airline. So we'll be refactoring that. Also want to remind you, though, that your project 2 is due before class on Wednesday. And you've got two quizzes. You've got your quiz 4, and then you also have the reflection on your pair programming experiences. So you had two of those over the last couple of weeks, and now I'd like you to reflect on what you experienced. And let me know what you thought. I'm really curious to read those. As I was curious, I meant to mention this at the beginning of class, as I was curious and quite gratified by the feedback that I received from you in your midterm surveys. Thank you very much for taking the time to tell me what you thought about the course. Overall, everybody seemed to be felt that it was compelling, and hey, you've made it this far, so let's just the second half. I appreciate your feedback about the koans and how, yeah, there are a lot of them. Some of them are kind of repetitive, and I don't disagree. And there's some couple of good ideas for what I can be doing differently in the future. So thanks. This is how I make the course better. Being able to hear from you in your own words about about how you interpret the course, how you're experiencing the course, helps me provide a higher quality um, uh, instructional delivery to all of you. And with that, we're done. So, hey, thanks for attending, the folks who attended. Thank you for listening, everybody who watched the video. Again, as you begin working with the code, as you explore the project more, please be sure to bring up any topics that you have on the Slack so that I can respond to you with my answers. And I do encourage you to ask in the general Joy of Coding channel so that everybody can see your question and my responses. Have a great couple of days, everybody. I will see you again on Wednesday.